There's a space between words and silence, a space that can feel heavy, confusing, and sometimes even lonely. When the talking stops, we're left with ourselves, our thoughts, our fears, and the stories we create to make sense of the silence. And it's in this quiet that we often find our most profound truths. Vulnerability is often misunderstood as weakness. We live in a world that teaches us to armor up, to protect ourselves from hurt, rejection, and disappointment. But the truth is, vulnerability is not about being weak or exposed. It's about being brave enough to show up as our authentic selves, even when the outcome is uncertain. That's where real power lies. When communication halts and silence enters the space, it's easy to feel powerless. You might think, did I say the wrong thing? Did I do something wrong? Those doubts creep in, and suddenly the silence feels suffocating. But this discomfort is an invitation, a chance to lean into vulnerability. Instead of closing off or overanalyzing, we can choose to pause and recognize that silence, while uncomfortable, holds the potential for deeper understanding. Vulnerability in these moments is not about forcing a conversation or demanding answers. It's about staying open to what the silence reveals about us. How do we handle uncertainty? What stories are we telling ourselves about the situation? Are we willing to acknowledge our fears and insecurities without letting them define us? Being vulnerable means letting go of the need to control how others perceive us and instead embracing our humanity. Think of vulnerability as a doorway. Behind it is the courage to risk being seen, even when there are no guarantees of connection. It's the courage to say, this is who I am and I'm okay with that, even if others don't respond the way I hope. When you accept that silence isn't always a reflection of your worth, but rather a part of the human experience, you begin to reclaim your power. Here's where it gets tricky. Vulnerability doesn't protect you from pain. It simply gives you the strength to face it. When someone stops talking or pulls away, your instinct might be to build walls to protect yourself from the hurt. But walls don't just keep pain out. They keep connection out too. The paradox of vulnerability is that by allowing ourselves to feel discomfort, we become stronger. We learn to navigate the complexities of relationships with courage and compassion instead of fear and avoidance. Vulnerability also requires self-trust. It's about believing that you can handle the silence and whatever comes next. Trust that your worth isn't tied to someone else's actions or silence. Trust that you are enough, even if the conversation doesn't resume. Trust that the courage to remain open is a gift you give yourself, not something dependent on anyone else's validation. In those moments of silence, remember, vulnerability is not the enemy. It's the foundation of true power. It gives you the strength to stay grounded in your truth, to hold space for your emotions, and to remain open to the possibility of connection, even when the path feels unclear. By leaning into vulnerability, you create space not only for healing, but also for growth, resilience, and authentic relationships. That's the kind of power no silence can take away. Discomfort is an unavoidable part of life, especially when it comes to relationships and communication. When the talking stops and silence takes its place, we're left with an uneasy stillness that forces us to confront emotions we often try to avoid. That moment, however uncomfortable, is where courage comes in, not the kind of courage that roars, but the quiet, steady kind that invites us to stay, listen, and learn instead of running away. Facing discomfort is an act of bravery because it means sitting with uncertainty. When someone goes quiet, we instinctively seek clarity. Our minds race to fill in the blanks, often with assumptions or self-doubt. What did I do wrong? Are they upset? Do they care about me anymore? The courage to face discomfort means pausing before we spiral into these narratives and asking ourselves, what is this silence trying to teach me? This moment of discomfort is an invitation to lean into self-awareness. It's not just about what the other person is thinking or feeling. It's about what the silence stirs within us. Maybe it's fear of rejection, insecurity, or a need for reassurance. Whatever it is, discomfort reveals the places where we need to grow. The courage to face it allows us to see these truths not as flaws, but as opportunities to better understand ourselves and our emotional needs. But courage doesn't stop at self-awareness. It also calls us to resist the temptation to avoid the hard stuff. Our instinct might be to ignore the silence, distract ourselves, or overcompensate with overthinking or excessive action. Real courage, however, is choosing to sit in the silence, even when it feels unbearable. It's trusting that discomfort, though challenging, won't break us. Discomfort is not the enemy. It's a signal that something important is happening. It's a reminder that connection, growth, and understanding often come at a cost. They require vulnerability, honesty, and the willingness to be uncomfortable. Courage means recognizing this truth and stepping into that discomfort with an open heart and a steady resolve. You should have the courage to feel your feelings. It's also important to remember that courage doesn't mean forcing clarity or resolution. Sometimes the best thing we can do in the face of silence is to honor the space it creates. Courage might look like giving the other person time to process or reflect, even when we crave immediate answers. It might look like setting boundaries for ourselves, trusting that we don't have to fix everything or make everyone happy. When we face discomfort with courage, we reclaim our power. We stop trying to control the uncontrollable and instead focus on what we can do. Show up with authenticity, honor our emotions, and trust that growth comes through these difficult moments. Ultimately, the courage to face discomfort is what leads to transformation. It's what allows us to move through silence without losing ourselves. It's what helps us find clarity, compassion, and connection. Not by avoiding the hard things, but by embracing them with an open heart. When communication stops and silence fills the space, our minds go into overdrive. We begin crafting narratives to explain what's happening, often without realizing it. These stories can feel so real that they shape our emotions, decisions, and actions. But here's the truth. The stories we tell ourselves aren't always accurate. They're often reflections of our fears, insecurities, and past experiences rather than the reality of the situation. In the absence of words, we naturally seek meaning. Silence feels unsettling because it leaves gaps in our understanding. Our minds, eager to make sense of the unknown, start filling in the blanks. They must be upset with me. They don't care anymore. I must have done something wrong. These stories can feel so convincing that we accept them as fact, without questioning their validity. But the danger lies in how these stories impact us. They can trigger feelings of rejection, unworthiness, or frustration. They can lead us to act defensively, retreat emotionally, or make decisions based on assumptions rather than truth. Over time, these self-created narratives can erode our confidence and strain relationships. The key to breaking free from these stories is awareness. It starts with recognizing when you're crafting a narrative. Ask yourself, what am I telling myself about this silence? What evidence do I have to support this story? Often, you'll find that the evidence is thin, based more on your internal fears than external facts. It's also essential to acknowledge the emotional weight behind these stories. Silence can amplify feelings of vulnerability and uncertainty, which can make our stories feel more intense. Rather than judging yourself for these emotions, approach them with compassion. Understand that your mind is trying to protect you, even if it's doing so in unhelpful ways. One powerful tool for navigating these stories is curiosity. Instead of jumping to conclusions, stay open to the idea that there's more to the silence than you can see. Maybe the other person is processing their own emotions. Maybe they're dealing with challenges unrelated to you. Maybe the silence isn't about you at all. By staying curious, you create space for alternative explanations and prevent yourself from being trapped by a single narrative. Another key is communication. When the time feels right, consider addressing the silence directly, but with openness and humility. Instead of accusing or assuming, share how you feel. For example, you might say, I've noticed there's been some distance and I want to check in to understand where we stand. This approach invites clarity and connection rather than escalating misunderstanding. Instead of making things worse, criticizing and arguing is a natural reaction. Ultimately, the stories we tell ourselves shape our reality, but they don't have to define it. By pausing, questioning, and staying curious, we reclaim our power to respond to silence with grace and wisdom. Silence doesn't have to be a source of pain or confusion. It can be a space for reflection, understanding, and growth. And when we free ourselves from the grip of self-created narratives, we open the door to deeper connection, both with others and with ourselves. True connection is one of the most fulfilling experiences we can have as human beings. It is where we find belonging, love, and understanding. Yet connection is also one of the most vulnerable things we can pursue because it requires us to take risks. It demands that we show up authentically, even when there's no guarantee of how the other person will respond. And in the silence that often accompanies strained communication, that risk can feel even more daunting. When communication halts, the silence can feel like a void, a place where uncertainty thrives. In this space, fear creeps in. What if I've done something wrong? What if they don't feel the same way? What if I put myself out there and it's not reciprocated? These questions highlight the inherent risk of connection. To connect, we have to be willing to be seen, not as a polished version of ourselves, but as we truly are, imperfect, uncertain, and sometimes even afraid. Taking the risk of connection means embracing vulnerability, which is not about exposing every detail of ourselves, but about being honest and open. It's about saying, I care about this relationship enough to show up, even if it scares me. In moments of silence, the choice to lean into connection instead of retreating into self-protection can feel incredibly risky. But it's in those moments that the foundation for genuine relationships is built. Connection also requires courage because it means stepping into the unknown. When someone pulls back or goes quiet, it's natural to feel tempted to match their silence or protect yourself by withdrawing emotionally. But connection asks us to do the opposite, to remain present, to ask thoughtful questions, and to extend understanding even when we're unsure of how the other person feels. This doesn't mean abandoning healthy boundaries or overextending yourself. It means choosing to lead with empathy and curiosity instead of fear. It's also important to recognize that risk in connection isn't about guaranteeing a specific outcome. You can't control how someone else will respond to your efforts to reconnect or clarify misunderstandings. But the power of taking the risk lies in knowing that you are showing up authentically, regardless of the outcome. It's in understanding that the act of seeking connection, even in uncertainty, reflects your courage and commitment to meaningful relationships. Additionally, risk-taking in connection often requires us to accept that rejection or misunderstanding might occur. This is not a reflection of your worth, but rather a part of the messy, complex nature of human relationships. Even when connection doesn't unfold as you hoped, the experience of taking the risk helps you grow stronger and more resilient. Ultimately, connection isn't about perfection. It's about presence. It's about choosing to stay open when it would be easier to close off, to try again when fear tells you to stop, and to believe that the rewards of authentic relationships are worth the vulnerability they require. By taking the risk to connect, you create space for deeper understanding, healing, and love, not just with others, but with yourself. In every moment of silence, uncertainty, or discomfort in our relationships, there lies an opportunity, a chance to grow, to reflect, and to deepen our connections. Whether it's embracing vulnerability as a source of strength, summoning the courage to face discomfort, challenging the stories we tell ourselves, or taking the risk to connect, each step is a profound act of bravery.
Quote,
True connection is not about perfection or control. It's about showing up as your authentic self, even when the outcome is unknown. It's about leaning into the messy, imperfect nature of human relationships and trusting that every moment, whether filled with words or silence, has the potential to teach us something valuable. The silence may feel unsettling, even painful, but it's also a space for possibility. It invites us to listen, to understand, and to trust that connection, though risky, is always worth the effort. And in those moments when you choose to stay open, to hold space for yourself and others, and to lead with compassion, you're building something far greater than fleeting understanding. You're building relationships rooted in authenticity, resilience, and love. So take a breath, lean into the uncertainty, and remember, the strongest connections are forged not in the absence of risk, but in the courage to embrace it.